The air in late August 1849 hung thick and heavy over the Ashford plantation, a sprawling estate carved into the rich, dark soil of rural Mississippi. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under a sky that had turned a strange, yellowing gray, like old parchment held too close to flame. The heat was suffocating, even for those accustomed to the relentless southern sun. Elijah wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his calloused hand. He was 32 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his skin the deep brown of polished walnut. His hands were scarred from years of picking cotton, chopping wood, and building the wealth of men who would never know his name. But his eyes, those eyes still held something the overseers hadn't been able to break. Not yet. "Papa, are the clouds angry?" Samuel asked, tugging at Elijah's torn sleeve. The boy was 7, small for his age, with his mother's soft features and his father's quiet intensity. Elijah crouched down, placing a gentle hand on his son's head. "No, son, the sky's just tired, like us." Ruth appeared from behind the row of cotton, a woven basket balanced on her hip. She was 28, her face still beautiful despite the exhaustion etched into every line. Her eyes found Elijah's, and in that glance, an entire conversation passed, one of love, of endurance, of unspoken fear. "Storm's coming," she said quietly. "Big one. Old Moses said he felt it in his bones this morning." Elijah nodded. Old Moses had survived more hurricanes than anyone on the plantation. If he said a storm was coming, it was coming. "We'll be all right," Elijah said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The overseer's whistle cut through the humid air, a sharp, cruel sound that sent a chill down Elijah's spine despite the heat. Thomas Ridley, the head overseer, sat atop his horse at the edge of the field, his face red and glistening with sweat beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He was a man who enjoyed his power, who relished the fear in the eyes of those he controlled. "You there, stop your damn talking and get back to work. You think this cotton picks itself?" Elijah straightened slowly, his jaw tightening. He met Ridley's gaze for just a fraction of a second, long enough to communicate defiance, short enough to avoid a whipping. "Yes, sir," Elijah said flatly. Ridley spat into the dirt and rode off, barking orders at others down the line. Ruth touched Elijah's arm gently. "Don't," she whispered. "Not today." "I know," Elijah replied, his voice tight. By late afternoon, the wind had begun to pick up, sending dust devils spinning through the rows of cotton. The enslaved workers moved faster now, sensing the urgency in the air. The sky had darkened to a bruised purple, and the distant rumble of thunder rolled across the flatlands like the growl of some ancient awakening beast. The bell rang, 2 sharp clangs, signaling the end of the workday. But instead of heading back to their cabins, the workers were corralled toward the barn. "Listen up," Ridley shouted from his horse. "Master Ashford says the storm's going to be bad, real bad. Y'all are to stay in the barn tonight. No fires, no noise. You keep your heads down and you stay put. Understood?" A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the crowd. Elijah felt Ruth's hand slip into his. He squeezed it tightly. As the enslaved families shuffled toward the barn, a massive, leaking structure that smelled of hay and animal waste, Elijah glanced back toward the main house. It sat on a hill overlooking the plantation, a grand white structure with tall columns and wide verandas. Lanterns glowed warmly in the windows. Through the glass, he could see the Ashford family moving about, comfortable, safe, untouchable. Inside the barn, families huddled together on thin blankets and piles of straw. Children whimpered. Mothers whispered prayers. The wind outside howled louder now, rattling the wooden walls. Samuel curled up against Ruth's side, his small body trembling. "Mama, I'm scared." Ruth stroked his hair gently. "I know, baby, but your papa's here. We're all here. We're gonna be fine." Elijah sat with his back against the barn wall, his arm around his wife and son. He stared at the cracked wood above them, listening to the storm gather its fury. And then it hit. The wind came first, a roaring, screaming force that tore at the barn like a living thing. The walls shuddered, the roof groaned. Rain hammered down in sheets, leaking through every gap and crack, turning the dirt floor to mud. People screamed, children cried, someone started praying aloud, a desperate, broken plea to a God who seemed very far away. Elijah pulled Ruth and Samuel closer, wrapping his body around theirs as the storm raged. The barn shook violently, and somewhere in the distance he heard the unmistakable sound of wood splintering, of structures collapsing. "Stay with me," Elijah said into Ruth's ear. "No matter what, stay with me." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and held Samuel tighter. The hurricane had arrived, and with it, the end of everything Elijah had ever known. Before we continue deeper into this dark and harrowing journey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here at Twisted of Fate, consider subscribing. Stories like this deserve to be told and remembered. Now, do you prepare to witness how the fury of nature became nothing compared to the fury of one man who lost everything? The hurricane didn't just arrive, it devoured. Within an hour, the barn had become a nightmare. Water poured through the roof in thick streams, pooling ankle-deep on the floor. The wind shrieked through every crack and crevice, carrying with it the smell of rain, earth, and something else. Something feral and ancient, like the breath of a god who had finally grown tired of watching. Elijah held Ruth and Samuel as tightly as he could, but the chaos made it nearly impossible to stay together. Bodies pressed against them from all sides, men, women, children, all clinging to one another in terror. The barn walls buckled and swayed. Somewhere in the darkness, a support beam cracked with a sound like a gunshot. "We have to get out," someone shouted. "No, we stay here. Master's orders," another voice countered. But orders meant nothing now. The storm didn't care about masters or slaves. It was an equalizer, indifferent and absolute. A section of the roof tore away with a deafening roar, exposing the swirling black sky above. Rain lashed down like whips. The wind grabbed at everything, blankets, straw, even small children, and tried to pull them into the void. "Elijah!" Ruth screamed, clutching Samuel to her chest. "We can't stay here, it's coming down!" Elijah's mind raced. She was right. The barn wouldn't hold much longer, but where could they go? The cabins were even flimsier, the fields offered no shelter. And the main house, his eyes turned toward the hill, the main house. "Come on!" Elijah shouted, pulling Ruth to her feet. He scooped Samuel into his arms, the boy's small body shaking violently. "We go to the house." "They won't let us in," Ruth cried. "They will if we're dying." Other families had the same idea. A surge of people pushed toward the barn doors, which had been latched from the outside. Men threw their shoulders against the wood again and again, until finally the latch splintered and the doors flew open. The storm swallowed them whole. The rain was a solid wall of water, blinding and relentless. The wind knocked Elijah sideways, nearly tearing Samuel from his arms. He planted his feet, lowered his head, and pushed forward. Ruth's hand locked in his. Around them, people were swept away. An elderly woman stumbled and was carried off by the floodwaters that had already begun to rise. A man was struck by flying debris, a piece of fence or roofing, and crumpled to the ground, motionless. Elijah didn't stop. He couldn't. "Keep moving!" He roared over the storm. The path to the main house had become a river. Mud sucked at their feet. The wind howled like a chorus of the damned. But Elijah could see the lights of the house ahead, glowing faintly through the deluge. They reached the front steps. Elijah pounded on the door with his fist. "Open up, please! We're drowning out here." Nothing. He pounded again, harder. "Open the door! For God's sake, open the door!" Ruth joined him, her voice raw with desperation. "Please! We have a child! Please!" Inside, through the rain-streaked windows, Elijah could see movement, shadows passing back and forth. The Ashford family and their overseers, safe and dry, watching the storm from behind their walls. Watching them die. Thomas Ridley's face appeared in the window. His expression was cold, unmoved. He shook his head slowly, deliberately, and then turned away. The door did not open. "No," Ruth whispered, her voice breaking. "No, no, no." A massive gust of wind slammed into them. Elijah lost his footing, and Samuel was ripped from his arms. "Samuel!" Elijah screamed. The boy tumbled across the flooded ground, his small arms flailing. Ruth lunged after him, her fingers just brushing his shirt before the water pulled him under. "Ruth, no!" Elijah shouted, but she was already gone, diving into the torrent after their son. Elijah threw himself forward, his hands grasping wildly in the churning water. His fingers closed around fabric, Ruth's dress. He pulled with all his strength, dragging her back to the surface. She came up gasping, her eyes wide with terror. "Where is he? Where's Samuel?" Elijah's heart shattered. Samuel was gone. The water had taken him. "No!" Ruth screamed, a sound so raw and primal it cut through even the roar of the storm. She tried to pull away, tried to dive back in, but Elijah held her with iron strength. "He's gone, Ruth! He's gone! Let me go! Let me go! I have to find him! He's gone!" She collapsed against him, her body racked with sobs, her screams turning to choked, wordless wails of agony. Elijah held her, his own tears mixing with the rain, his chest heaving with a grief so deep it felt like drowning. Behind them, the main house remained closed. The lights inside flickered warmly, safe, comfortable, indifferent. A tree snapped nearby, its massive trunk crashing down just feet away. The ground shook, the floodwaters rose higher. "We have to move," Elijah said hoarsely. "Ruth, we have to move." She didn't respond. She had gone limp in his arms, her eyes staring blankly into the storm. Elijah lifted her, his wife, his everything, and carried her away from the house, away from the closed door, away from the place where their son had been swallowed by the water. He stumbled through the darkness, his body battered by wind and rain, until he found a slight rise in the land, a small grove of trees that offered minimal shelter. He laid Ruth down beneath the branches and covered her with his own body, shielding her from the worst of the storm. And there, in the howling dark, Elijah made a promise to Samuel, to Ruth, to himself. If they survived this night, someone would pay. They all would pay. The storm passed sometime before dawn, leaving behind a silence that was almost worse than the noise. Elijah opened his eyes to a world transformed. The sky was a pale, sickly grey, and the air smelled of wet earth, broken wood, and death. The grove where he had taken shelter was littered with debris, shattered branches, torn cloth, unidentifiable wreckage. Ruth lay beside him, unconscious but breathing. Her face was pale, her lips tinged blue. Elijah sat up slowly, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. His clothes were soaked through, caked with mud. His hands were cut and bleeding, but he was alive. He looked down at Ruth and gently brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. "Ruth," he whispered, "wake up, please." Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she seemed confused, disoriented. Then memory came flooding back, and her face crumpled. "Samuel," she whispered. Elijah said nothing. There was nothing to say. She turned away from him, curling into herself, her body shaking with silent sobs. Elijah stood, his legs unsteady. He looked out over the plantation, or what was left of it. The devastation was total. The cotton fields were submerged, vast lakes of muddy water stretching as far as the eye could see. The cabins where the enslaved families had lived were gone, reduced to piles of splintered wood and scattered belongings. The barn had collapsed entirely, its roof caved in, its walls flattened. And bodies. There were bodies everywhere. Elijah's stomach turned. He saw old Moses face down in the mud. He saw a young mother he recognized, her arms still wrapped around her infant child, both of them motionless. He saw men he had worked beside for years, men whose names he knew, whose stories he had heard, all of them broken and still, so many dead. And on the hill, untouched and pristine, stood the main house. Not a single window broken, not a single shingle missing. Elijah stared at it, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists. They had watched, they had listened to the screaming, to the begging, to the dying, and they had done nothing. Behind him, Ruth stirred. She sat up slowly, her movements mechanical, like a puppet whose strings were barely attached. "I want to find him," she said quietly. "I want to find Samuel." Elijah turned to her. "Ruth, I need to find him," she said, her voice stronger now, edged with desperation. "I need to bury him. I need to—" Her voice broke, and she pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking. Elijah knelt beside her and pulled her into his arms. "We'll find him," he said softly. "I promise. We'll find him." They spent the morning searching. The floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving behind a landscape of mud and ruin. Bodies floated in the remaining pools. Personal belongings, shoes, tools, dolls, were scattered like forgotten memories. They found Samuel near the edge of the property, tangled in the roots of a fallen oak tree. His small body was pale, his eyes closed, his face peaceful. He looked like he was sleeping. Ruth sank to her knees beside him and gathered him into her arms, rocking him gently, humming the lullaby she used to sing to him every night. Elijah stood over them, his fists clenched so tightly his nails drew blood from his palms. He looked up at the sky, the pale, indifferent sky, and felt something inside him break. Not his spirit, not his will, his mercy. They buried Samuel beneath a willow tree at the edge of the property. Elijah dug the grave with his bare hands, clawing at the muddy earth until his fingers bled. Ruth sat nearby, silent and hollow, her eyes fixed on nothing. When it was done, Elijah stood over the small mound of earth and spoke quietly. "I will remember you," he said, "every day, every breath. I will remember." He turned and looked back toward the main house. "And I will make them remember too." In the days following the hurricane, the Ashford plantation became a graveyard with a pulse. The survivors moved like ghosts, their faces hollow, their eyes distant. They dug graves. They salvaged what little could be salvaged. They rebuilt what could be rebuilt. And through it all, the white overseers barked orders, their whips cracking in the air, as if nothing had changed, as if the storm had never happened. Elijah worked in silence. He hauled debris. He cleared mud from the fields. He repaired fences, but inside, something had shifted. The man who had once endured with quiet strength was gone. In his place was something colder, sharper, more dangerous. Ruth had not spoken since the burial. She moved through the days like a sleepwalker, her hands performing tasks mechanically, her eyes vacant. Elijah watched her with a pain that went deeper than any wound, knowing that a part of her had died with Samuel and might never come back. At night, in the cramped quarters they now shared with 3 other families in one of the few remaining structures, Elijah lay awake. He stared at the ceiling and thought. He thought about the closed door. He thought about Thomas Ridley's cold face in the window. He thought about Master Ashford and his family, sitting safe and warm while children drowned outside. And he thought about justice, or vengeance. Perhaps they were the same thing. 1 week after the storm, the overseers began pushing the workers harder. The cotton crop had been destroyed, but there was still work to be done. Clearing land, repairing buildings, preparing for the next planting season. Master Ashford had lost a significant portion of his property in the hurricane, and he was determined to extract every ounce of labor from those who remained. Thomas Ridley was everywhere, his presence a constant reminder of the cruelty that defined their existence. He rode through the fields on his horse, his whip coiled at his side, his eyes always watching. One afternoon, as Elijah worked to clear a collapsed shed, Ridley approached. "You," Ridley said, pointing his whip at Elijah, "you're moving too slow. Pick up the pace." Elijah continued working, his movements steady and deliberate. "Did you hear me, boy?" Ridley's voice rose. "I said move faster." Elijah straightened slowly, his back still turned to the overseer. He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the wooden beam he'd been carrying. "I heard you," Elijah said quietly. "Then do as you're told." Elijah turned, and for a moment, just a brief, electric moment, he looked directly into Ridley's eyes. What Ridley saw there made him stiffen. It was a look devoid of fear, devoid of submission. It was a look that promised something dark and inevitable. Ridley's hand went to his whip. "You got a problem, boy?" Elijah said nothing. He lowered his gaze and returned to his work. Ridley watched him for a long moment, then spat into the dirt and rode away. But that night, Elijah began to plan. He started by observing. He noted the routines of the overseers, when they made their rounds, where they went when they were alone. He studied the layout of the plantation, the locations of tools, the weak points in structures. He also listened. In the evenings, when the remaining enslaved workers gathered in quiet, exhausted groups, they spoke in hushed tones. They spoke of the storm, of the dead, of the cruelty that had only intensified in the aftermath, and some of them spoke of something else. "I heard old Daniel talking," a man named Isaac whispered one night. "He said there's others who want to fight back, who are tired of taking it." "Fight back how?" someone asked nervously. "I don't know, but he said if it came to it, he'd rather die free than live like this." The others murmured in agreement, though their voices were tinged with fear. Elijah sat quietly in the corner, listening. He said nothing, but his mind worked. He would not involve others. Not yet. This was his burden to carry, his promise to keep, but when the time came, he would not hesitate. 3 weeks after the storm, an opportunity presented itself. Thomas Ridley had taken to drinking more heavily in the evenings. Elijah had noticed him stumbling back from the main house late at night, his steps unsteady, his guard down. One night, Elijah watched from the shadows as Ridley made his way toward the overseer's cabin, a small building set apart from the main house where the overseers slept. Ridley was alone. Elijah's heart began to pound. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. He had found a knife 2 days earlier, a rusty, discarded thing he'd pulled from the wreckage of the storm. He had sharpened it carefully, methodically, running it against a stone until the blade gleamed. Now it was hidden beneath his shirt, cold against his skin. He followed Ridley at a distance, his footsteps silent in the darkness. Ridley reached his cabin, fumbled with the door, and went inside. A lamp flickered to life in the window. Elijah waited. He counted to 100, then 200. Then he moved. The overseer's cabin was dark, except for the single lamp burning in the window. Elijah approached slowly, his heart hammering in his chest, every nerve in his body alive with a strange, terrible clarity. This was the moment. The line he was about to cross could never be uncrossed. He knew this. He accepted it. The door was unlocked. Ridley was careless when he drank, arrogant in his belief that no slave would ever dare raise a hand against him. Tonight, that arrogance would cost him everything. Elijah slipped inside, silent as a shadow. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished. A bed, a table, a chair, a shelf with a few bottles of whiskey. Ridley sat in the chair, his back to the door, his head tilted back, a half-empty bottle in his hand. He was humming something, a tune Elijah didn't recognize, something cheerful, absurdly out of place in this world of suffering. Elijah closed the door behind him with a soft click. Ridley's humming stopped. "That you, Jenkins? I told you I don't need—" He turned, his eyes widened. Elijah stood in the doorway, the knife in his hand, his face expressionless. "You," Ridley breathed. He tried to stand, his hand reaching for the whip on the table, but the alcohol had made him slow. Elijah was faster. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and drove his fist into Ridley's throat. The overseer gagged, stumbling backward, his hands clawing at his neck. Elijah grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "Do you remember?" Elijah said quietly, his voice steady. "Do you remember the storm?" Ridley's eyes bulged. He tried to speak, but only a strangled rasp came out. "I stood at that door," Elijah continued, his face inches from Ridley's. "I begged, my wife begged, we had a child, a 7-year-old boy, and you looked at us through that window and you shook your head." Tears streamed down Ridley's face now. He shook his head frantically, his lips moving soundlessly. "My son drowned," Elijah said, "and you did nothing." He raised the knife. "Please," Ridley finally managed to choke out. "Please, I was following orders." Master Ashford said. "I don't care," Elijah said, and he drove the knife into Ridley's stomach. The overseer's eyes went wide. His mouth opened in a silent scream. Elijah twisted the blade and pulled it out, then stabbed again, and again, and again. Blood poured from the wounds, soaking Ridley's shirt, pooling on the floor. The overseer's body went limp, sliding down the wall, his eyes still open, still staring. Elijah stepped back, breathing hard, his hands slick with blood. He looked down at Ridley's body and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, just a cold, hollow emptiness. One down. He cleaned the knife on Ridley's shirt, tucked it back into his belt, and left the cabin as silently as he had entered. Outside, the night was still and quiet. The plantation slept, unaware that the first blow had been struck. Elijah walked back to his quarters, his mind already moving to the next name on his list. When Ridley's body was discovered the next morning, the plantation erupted into chaos. Master Ashford called an emergency assembly. Every enslaved person was ordered to the clearing in front of the main house. The remaining overseers stood in a line, their faces grim, their hands resting on their whips and pistols. Master William Ashford stood on the porch, his face red with fury. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with thinning hair and the soft hands of someone who had never done a day's hard labor in his life. "One of you," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage, "murdered Thomas Ridley last night, stabbed him like a dog in his own home." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elijah stood in the back, his face blank, his hands at his sides. "I want to know who did it," Ashford continued, "and I want to know now, if the guilty party comes forward, they will be hanged quickly, mercifully. But if you make me search you out, I promise you, every single one of you will suffer." Silence. No one moved, no one spoke. Ashford's face darkened. "Very well. Jenkins, Wallace, start searching the cabins. Tear them apart if you have to. I want every knife, every sharp object, every potential weapon accounted for." The overseers moved into action, their boots thudding against the muddy ground as they headed toward the living quarters. Elijah watched them go. The knife was no longer with him. He had buried it in the woods the night before, along with his blood-stained shirt. They would find nothing. The searches went on for hours. Cabins were ransacked. Personal belongings were dumped into the mud, but no evidence was found. By late afternoon, Ashford was livid. He stood on the porch again, his hands clenched into fists. "If no one confesses," he said slowly, "I will begin selecting people at random, and they will hang until someone talks." A woman near the front began to cry. Others shifted nervously. Elijah felt Ruth's hand slip into his. He looked down at her. Her face was pale, her eyes red from sleepless nights, but she squeezed his hand tightly. She knew. She didn't know the details, but she knew. And she said nothing. "You have until tomorrow morning," Ashford said. "Think carefully." The crowd was dismissed. As people shuffled away, Elijah and Ruth walked slowly back toward their quarters. "Elijah," Ruth said quietly, "what have you done?" "What needed to be done?" he replied. "They'll kill us, all of us. They were already killing us, just slower." Ruth stopped walking. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Is this for Samuel?" she asked. "Will it bring him back?" "No." "Then why?" Elijah looked at her for a long moment. "Because they need to know," he said finally, "that we are not animals, that we feel, that we remember, and that there are consequences." Ruth said nothing. She simply nodded, and they walked on in silence. That night, Elijah returned to the woods. He dug up the knife, cleaned it again, and prepared for the next name on his list. Jenkins, the overseer who had led the searches that day, and after him, Wallace, and after him, the Ashford family itself. He would take his time. He would be careful, but he would not stop until every one of them had paid. The next 2 nights passed without incident, but the tension on the plantation was suffocating. Master Ashford had made good on his threat. At dawn on the second day after Ridley's murder, He had 3 men pulled from the crowd at random, men who had nothing to do with the killing, and had them whipped in front of everyone. 20 lashes each, their backs torn open, their screams echoing across the fields. "This," Ashford had shouted to the assembled crowd, "is what happens when you protect murderers." Elijah had watched in silence, his face carved from stone, as the 3 men collapsed, bloodied and broken, into the mud. He felt the weight of their suffering, but he did not waver. That night, Jenkins died. The overseer had been making his rounds near the tobacco barn, checking the locks, when Elijah emerged from the shadows. Jenkins barely had time to register the figure before him, before the knife found his throat. Unlike Ridley, Jenkins went down quietly, gurgling and clutching at the wound as his lifeblood spilled into the dirt. Elijah dragged the body into the tobacco barn and left it there, knowing it would be found in the morning. Let them find it. Let them fear. When Jenkins's body was discovered, the plantation descended into paranoia. Ashford brought in dogs, bloodhounds, trained to track and hunt. He brought in armed men from neighboring plantations, rough, cruel men who looked at the enslaved workers with barely concealed contempt. The night patrols doubled. Armed overseers walked the grounds in pairs, their rifles loaded, their eyes scanning the darkness. And still, Elijah moved like a ghost. He had grown up on this land. He knew every tree, every path, every hiding place. He knew where the patrols would be and when. He knew how to move without sound, how to blend into shadow. The overseers were hunting him, but they didn't even know what they were looking for. On the 4th night, he took Wallace. The overseer had been standing guard near the main house, his rifle slung over his shoulder, a lantern in his hand. Elijah watched him from the trees, patient, waiting for the moment when Wallace turned his back. When it came, Elijah struck. He moved silently across the open ground, his knife in hand. Wallace heard something at the last second, a rustle, a breath, and turned, but it was too late. Elijah drove the blade up under Wallace's ribs, angling toward the heart. The overseer gasped, his mouth opening wide, his eyes locking onto Elijah's. "Why?" Wallace whispered, blood bubbling at his lips. "Because you let my son die," Elijah said quietly. He twisted the knife, and Wallace went limp. Elijah lowered the body to the ground, wiped the blade clean, and disappeared back into the night. Mamniur. By the 5th day, the plantation was in full lockdown. No one was allowed to move freely after dark. Families were confined to their quarters under armed guard. The overseers moved in groups of 4 or more, their weapons always drawn. Master Ashford stood on his porch every morning, his face haggard, his eyes wild. He ranted about betrayal, about savagery, about the need for control. "We are not safe," he shouted to his remaining overseers. "Do you understand? We are not safe until this animal is caught and killed." But they couldn't catch him, because Elijah had stopped acting like prey. He had become the hunter. On the 6th night, Elijah made his boldest move yet. He entered the main house. He had studied its layout for years, watching from the fields, glimpsing through windows, listening to the overseers talk. He knew which doors were kept unlocked, which floorboards creaked, which rooms were occupied. He slipped in through the kitchen door just after midnight, when the house was dark and quiet. The servants, enslaved people who worked inside, were asleep in their small rooms off the kitchen. Elijah moved past them silently, his knife in hand, his heart steady. He climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. At the end of the hall was Master Ashford's bedroom. Elijah stood outside the door for a long moment listening. He could hear snoring inside, deep, guttural, the sound of a man who felt safe in his own home. Elijah's hand went to the doorknob, and then he heard footsteps behind him. He spun, his knife raised, and found himself face to face with Catherine Ashford, Master Ashford's 16-year-old daughter. She stood in her nightgown, her eyes wide with shock, her mouth opening to scream. Elijah moved. He crossed the distance between them in an instant and clamped his hand over her mouth, pressing her back against the wall. His knife came up to her throat. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't scream. Don't move." Catherine's eyes were enormous, filled with terror. Tears streamed down her cheeks. For a moment Elijah looked at her, really looked at her. She was a child, not much older than Samuel would have been in a few years. She had never lifted a whip, never locked a door. She had been born into this evil, raised in it, but she herself had not killed anyone. Elijah hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Catherine bit down hard on his hand. Elijah jerked back, stifling a curse, and Catherine screamed, "Papa! Papa! Help!" The door to Ashford's bedroom flew open. Master Ashford stood there in his nightshirt, a pistol in his hand, his face pale. "You!" he breathed, staring at Elijah. Elijah didn't wait. He bolted down the hall, vaulted down the stairs, and crashed through the kitchen door just as the pistol fired behind him. The bullet splintered the doorframe, missing him by inches. Shouts erupted throughout the house. Footsteps thundered on the stairs. Elijah ran. He tore across the grounds, his legs pumping, his breath ragged. Behind him, lanterns blazed to life. Dogs barked. Men shouted. He reached the tree line and disappeared into the woods. They pursued him, but the darkness was his ally. He moved through the forest like smoke, his knowledge of the land guiding him. By the time the sun rose, he was miles away, hidden in a hollow beneath a fallen oak, his body aching, his hand bleeding where Catherine had bitten him. But he was alive, and the hunt was not over. Elijah didn't return to the plantation for 3 days. He stayed in the woods, surviving on wild berries, creek water, and the occasional rabbit he managed to trap. His hand throbbed from the bite, the wound red and swollen, but he cleaned it as best he could with water and wrapped it in torn strips of cloth. He knew he couldn't stay away forever. Ruth was still there, and so were the people he'd promised to make pay. But now, everything had changed. They knew who he was. On the third night, hunger and desperation drove him back toward the plantation. He moved carefully, staying in the shadows, watching from the tree line. What he saw made his blood run cold. The plantation had been transformed into a fortress. Armed guards patrolled constantly, their rifles gleaming in the torchlight. The main house was lit up like a beacon, every window glowing, every door barred. Dogs prowled the grounds, their handlers keeping them on short leashes. And in the center of the clearing, illuminated by torches, stood a gallows, freshly built, waiting. Elijah's stomach dropped, and then he saw her. Ruth. She was on her knees in the mud, her hands bound behind her back, her face bruised and swollen. 2 guards stood over her, their rifles pointed at her head. Master Ashford stood nearby, his arms crossed, his face twisted with satisfaction. "He'll come back," Ashford said loudly, his voice carrying across the clearing. "He'll come back for her, and when he does, we'll have him." Elijah's hands clenched into fists. His heart pounded in his chest. They were using her as bait. He wanted to run to her, to tear through every guard between them, but he forced himself to stay still, to think. If he revealed himself now, they would both die. He needed a plan. For the next 2 nights, Elijah watched. He studied the patrols, the timing of the guard shifts, the positions of the dogs. He noted which guards were vigilant and which grew lazy as the nights wore on, and he waited. Ruth remained on her knees in the clearing, exposed to the elements. They gave her water but little food. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply knelt there, her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent prayer. Elijah's heart broke watching her, but he didn't move. Not yet. On the 3rd night, his opportunity came. A storm rolled in, not a hurricane, but a hard, driving rain that turned the ground to mud and reduced visibility to almost nothing. The guards huddled under makeshift shelters, their rifles wrapped in cloth to keep them dry. The dogs were brought inside, and Ruth was left alone in the clearing, tied to a post, her head bowed against the rain. Elijah moved. He circled around the edge of the plantation, avoiding the main paths, staying low. The rain masked his movements, the sound of it drumming against the earth, drowning out any noise he made. He reached the clearing and dropped to his stomach, crawling through the mud toward Ruth. "Ruth," he whispered when he was close enough. "Ruth, it's me." Her head lifted slowly, her eyes widened. "Elijah." she breathed. No, no, you have to go. It's a trap. I know, he said, pulling out his knife and sawing at the ropes binding her wrists. But I'm not leaving you. They'll kill you. They'll try. The ropes fell away. Ruth's hands were raw and bleeding where the bindings had cut into her skin. Elijah helped her to her feet, supporting her weight. Can you walk? He asked. She nodded, though her legs shook. They moved toward the tree line, slow and careful, the rain providing cover. They were almost there when a voice rang out. There, I see them! A gunshot cracked through the air. Mud exploded near Elijah's feet. Run! He shouted, grabbing Ruth's hand and pulling her forward. They crashed into the woods as more shots rang out behind them. Shouts filled the air. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness, moving toward them. Elijah pulled Ruth deeper into the forest, his lungs burning, his legs screaming. She stumbled and he caught her, half carrying her now. Behind them, the dogs were released. Their howls echoed through the trees, hungry and relentless. They're going to catch us, Ruth gasped. No, Elijah said. They're not. He knew these woods better than anyone, and he had one last trick. 10 minutes later, they reached the river. It was swollen from the rain, rushing fast and dark, the current treacherous. Can you swim? Elijah asked. Ruth nodded, though her face was pale with fear. Then we go in. The water will hide our scent from the dogs. They plunged into the river, the cold water shocking their systems. The current grabbed them immediately, pulling them downstream. Elijah held Ruth's hand tightly, kicking hard to keep their heads above water. Behind them, the dogs reached the riverbank and stopped, barking frantically, their handlers cursing and shouting. But the water carried Elijah and Ruth away, into the darkness beyond their reach. They dragged themselves onto the far bank nearly a mile downstream, coughing and shivering, their bodies battered and exhausted. Ruth collapsed onto the muddy ground, gasping for air. Elijah knelt beside her, his chest heaving. Are you hurt? She shook her head. Just tired. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel something other than cold determination, relief, fear, love. We can't go back, Ruth whispered. Not ever. I know, Elijah said. Then what do we do? Elijah was silent for a long moment. We finish it, he said finally. We finish what I started. Ruth pulled back, looking at him. How? Fire, Elijah said quietly. We burn it all to the ground. For the next week, Elijah and Ruth lived like fugitives in the wilderness. They moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a night. They foraged for food, rationed water, and avoided all signs of civilization. Elijah knew that slave catchers would be combing the area, and any encounter could mean death, or worse, capture. But they were free, for the first time in their lives, truly free. And yet, freedom felt hollow. Samuel was still dead. The Ashford family was still untouched. The plantation still stood. One night, as they huddled beneath a makeshift shelter of branches and leaves, Ruth finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. Are you really going to do it? Burn the plantation? Elijah stared into the small fire they dared to build, its flames dancing in the darkness. Yes, he said simply. And the people inside, the ones who let our son die? Yes. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I want to help. Elijah turned to her, surprised. Ruth, don't, she said, her voice firm. Don't tell me to stay behind. Don't tell me it's too dangerous. They took everything from us, Elijah. Everything. I want to be there when they pay. Elijah looked into her eyes and saw the same cold determination he'd felt growing inside himself since the storm. She wasn't the same woman she'd been before. None of them were. All right, he said. Then we plan together. Over the next few days, they formulated their strategy. The plantation was still on high alert, but Elijah knew that alertness would fade. People couldn't stay vigilant forever. Eventually, routines would return. Guards would grow complacent. They just had to wait. In the meantime, Elijah scouted the area, moving through the woods like a shadow, observing the plantation from a distance. He noted that the patrols had indeed begun to relax. The number of guards had been reduced. The dogs were no longer kept out at night. Master Ashford, it seemed, believed that Elijah and Ruth were long gone, fled north perhaps, or dead in the wilderness. That assumption would be his undoing. Elijah also gathered supplies. He found an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, its former occupant long dead or fled. Inside, he discovered a rusted axe, some rope, and, most importantly, a jug of kerosene. He brought it back to Ruth, his eyes gleaming. "This is it," he said. "This is how we do it." To Zed's Tarting, they chose a night 2 weeks after their escape. The moon was new, the sky dark, the air still and heavy. Perfect conditions for what they had planned. They approached the plantation from the north, moving silently through the fields, now overgrown and abandoned in the aftermath of the hurricane. The main house glowed faintly in the distance, a few lamps burning in the windows. Elijah carried the kerosene. Ruth carried bundles of dry kindling they'd gathered from the woods. They stopped at the edge of the property, crouching low. "The slave quarters first," Elijah whispered. "We make sure everyone's out, then the barns, then the house." Ruth nodded. They moved toward the remaining slave cabins, the few structures that had been rebuilt after the storm. Most were empty now, the families inside having been sold off or moved to other plantations after the unrest, but a few were still occupied. Elijah knocked quietly on the first door. An elderly man answered, his eyes widening when he saw who it was. "You," he breathed. "They said you were gone." "Listen to me," Elijah said urgently. "Get everyone out, everyone. Wake them up, get them dressed, and get them into the woods. Do it now. Don't ask questions. Just go." The man stared at him for a moment, then nodded. All right, all right." Within 15 minutes, the remaining enslaved families had been quietly roused and led into the safety of the trees. They didn't know what was coming, but they trusted Elijah. Or perhaps they simply sensed that change, violent, irreversible change, was at hand. Once the cabins were empty, Elijah and Ruth went to work. They started with the barns, the tobacco barn, the equipment shed, the remaining livestock shelters. Elijah splashed kerosene along the walls and across the dry hay inside. Ruth lit the kindling and tossed it through the open doors. The flames caught instantly, roaring to life with a hunger that seemed almost alive. Within minutes, the barns were engulfed, the fire climbing high into the night sky, casting flickering orange light across the plantation. Shouts erupted from the main house. Figures appeared on the porch. Master Ashford, his remaining overseers, his family. "Fire! Fire! Get the water!" But there was no saving the barns. The flames had taken hold too quickly, too completely. Elijah and Ruth moved toward the main house. This was the moment. Elijah doused the front porch with kerosene, then the sides of the house, working quickly and methodically. Ruth stood watch, her eyes scanning for guards. One appeared, running toward them with a rifle. Ruth picked up a heavy branch and swung it with all her strength, striking the man across the face. He went down hard, his rifle clattering to the ground. She stared down at him, breathing hard, her hands shaking. Then she picked up his rifle and kept watch. Elijah finished dousing the house and stepped back. He pulled out a tinderbox and struck it, the small flame flickering to life. He looked up at the grand white structure, the symbol of so much suffering, so much cruelty. "For Samuel," he said quietly, and he tossed the flame onto the porch. The fire exploded upward, racing along the trails of kerosene, consuming the wood, the paint, the carefully crafted facade of southern gentility. Screams erupted from inside the house. Windows shattered as people tried to escape. Master Ashford appeared on the second-floor balcony, his face contorted with rage and terror. "You!" he screamed, pointing at Elijah. "You did this! You'll hang! You'll burn in hell!" Elijah stood in the clearing, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "I'm already in hell," he said, "and so are you." The fire roared, unstoppable now, devouring the house from the inside out. Figures stumbled from the doors. Catherine Ashford, coughing and crying. Mrs. Ashford, her nightgown singed and smoking. The overseers, their faces blackened with soot, but Master Ashford didn't make it out. The second floor collapsed inward with a deafening crash, and his screams were swallowed by the flames. Elijah and Ruth stood together, watching the plantation burn. Around them, the freed families emerged from the woods, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their expressions a mixture of shock, fear, and something else, hope. "What do we do now?" Ruth asked quietly. Elijah took her hand. "We run," he said. "We run north, and we never look back." And so they did. Running was not the romantic escape that stories sometimes made it out to be. It was brutal. It was terrifying. It was an endless test of will, body, and spirit. Elijah and Ruth moved north, guided by the stars and the whispered directions of others who had fled before them. They traveled only at night, hiding during the day in dense thickets, abandoned cabins, or the homes of brave souls who risked everything to shelter runaways. The Underground Railroad was not a railroad at all, but a network of people, black and white, enslaved and free, who believed that no human being should be property. Elijah and Ruth were passed from hand to hand, house to house, moving through Tennessee, Kentucky, and into Ohio. Each stop was a gamble. Each day brought the possibility of discovery, capture, and death. Slave catchers prowled the roads. Bounty hunters tracked them with dogs. The law itself was against them. The Fugitive Slave Act ensured that even in free states they could be captured and returned to bondage. But they kept moving. In a small Quaker community in southern Ohio, they found temporary refuge. A woman named Hannah took them in, a stern-faced but kind-hearted widow who had been helping runaways for over a decade. She gave them food, clean clothes, and a place to sleep in her cellar. "You'll stay here 3 days," she said. "Rest, heal, then I'll arrange passage further north." Elijah and Ruth slept for nearly 20 hours straight, their bodies finally surrendering to exhaustion. When they woke, Hannah brought them hot soup and bread. "You've been through hell," she said, studying their faces. "I can see it in your eyes." "We're still in it," Ruth said quietly, "until we cross into Canada." Hannah nodded. "You will. I've helped dozens make it. You'll make it too." "What about the others?" Elijah asked. "The people from the plantation, do you know if any made it out?" "I've heard rumors," Hannah said carefully. "Some scattered into the woods and disappeared. Others were recaptured. A few may have made it north, but I don't know for certain." Elijah's jaw tightened. He thought of the families he'd warned that night, the people he'd freed from the cabins before the fire. He hoped they'd made it. He hoped they were running, just like him. Uriti skis 3 days later, they were on the move again. A conductor, a free black man named Moses, arrived in a covered wagon and smuggled them north, hidden beneath blankets and crates of grain. "Don't make a sound," Moses warned. "If we're stopped, they'll search the wagon. If they find you, we all hang." They traveled for hours, the wagon jolting and swaying over rough roads. Elijah held Ruth close, their hearts pounding in the suffocating darkness. At one point, the wagon stopped, voices outside, rough, demanding voices. "Where are you headed, boy?" "Just taking grain to the market in Cleveland, sir," Moses replied, his tone respectful but steady. "You hauling any runaways?" "No, sir, just grain." A pause. Footsteps approaching the back of the wagon. Elijah's hand went to the knife at his belt. If they were discovered, he wouldn't go quietly. The footsteps stopped. A long, agonizing silence. Then, "All right, move along." The wagon started again. Elijah released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They reached Cleveland 3 days later. From there they boarded a boat, a small, cramped vessel that would take them across Lake Erie into Canada. The crossing was rough, the water choppy, the wind cold. But when the shore of Canada finally came into view, tears streamed down Ruth's face. "We're free," she whispered. "We're really free." Elijah said nothing. He simply held her, his own eyes burning with emotion he didn't know how to name. They settled in a small town in Ontario, a community of other formerly enslaved people who had made the same perilous journey. Life was not easy. They had no money, no possessions, no connections. Elijah found work as a laborer, doing whatever jobs he could find. Ruth took in washing and mending, but they were together, and they were free. At night, they lay in the small room they rented, listening to the sounds of the town outside, and talked about the future. "Do you think we'll ever stop running?" Ruth asked one night. "In our minds, I mean." Elijah was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "I still see them sometimes. Samuel, the storm, the fire. I don't know if that ever goes away." "I see them too," Ruth said softly. "Every night." They held each other in the darkness, two people bound together by love and trauma, trying to build a life from the ashes of the old one. 5 years passed. Elijah and Ruth built a life in Canada. It wasn't the life they'd once imagined. Nothing could replace what had been stolen from them, but it was theirs. Elijah became known in the community as a skilled carpenter. He built homes, furniture, and helped construct a small church where the formerly enslaved gathered to worship, mourn, and celebrate their survival. Ruth became a teacher, helping newly arrived runaways learn to read and write. She poured her grief into purpose, determined that the children who passed through her classroom would have opportunities she and Elijah had never had. They never had another child. The loss of Samuel was a wound that never fully healed, and neither of them could bear the thought of trying to replace him. But they helped raise others. They became aunt and uncle to dozens of children in the community, offering guidance, support, and love. One autumn evening in 1854, a man arrived in town. He was older, his hair graying, his face lined with years of hardship. He asked around for Elijah, and someone directed him to the small house at the edge of the settlement. When Elijah opened the door, he didn't recognize the man at first. Then the man spoke. "Elijah, it's me, Isaac." Recognition dawned. Isaac had been one of the men from the plantation, one of the families Elijah had warned the night of the fire. "Isaac," Elijah breathed. "You made it." "I did," Isaac said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to you." They embraced, two men who had survived hell together. Inside, over cups of tea, Isaac told his story. He'd fled north with his wife and children the night of the fire. They'd been helped along the Underground Railroad, just like Elijah and Ruth, and had eventually settled in a town not far away. "I wanted to thank you," Isaac said, "for what you did, for giving us a chance." Elijah shook his head. "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know," Isaac said, "but you gave us something more than freedom. You gave us justice. You made them pay." Elijah looked away, his jaw tightening. "It didn't bring Samuel back." "No," Isaac said quietly, "but it meant something. It meant we weren't just victims, that we could fight back, that we could win." After Isaac left, Elijah sat alone on the porch, watching the sun set over the Canadian landscape. Ruth came out and sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Samuel," Elijah said. "I'm always thinking about Samuel." "Me too." They sat in silence for a while. Then Elijah said, "Do you think we did the right thing that night?" Ruth considered the question. "I think," she said slowly, "that we did the only thing we could. We were drowning, Elijah, all of us, and you gave us a way to breathe. But so many died. And so many lived." "Yes, because of you, because you refused to let them break you." Elijah closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. He would never know peace, not truly. The ghosts of the past would always haunt him. Samuel's small face, Ruth's screams, the flames consuming the plantation. But he had survived. They had survived. And in a world that had tried to strip them of their humanity, that in itself was a victory. Years later, after the Civil War, after slavery was abolished, after the world had changed in ways Elijah could never have imagined, an old man sat on a porch in Ontario. His hands were gnarled with age, his hair white, his body frail, but his eyes, those eyes still held fire. Children played in the yard, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people he'd once helped to freedom. Ruth had passed years before, her body finally giving out after a long and full life. Elijah missed her every day, But he knew she was at peace, and he knew that when his time came, he would see her again. And Samuel. Until then, he would sit on this porch, watching the sunset, and remember the storm, remember the fire, remember the long road north, and remember that he had been a slave who refused to die quietly. He had fought, he had survived, he had lived, and in the end, that was enough.